There has been a fire burning in the hearth of this inn for 140 years, and in all that time it has never once gone out. My great-grandfather lit it the winter he opened these doors, and my grandfather kept it, and my father, and now me. And the rule of this house, older than any of us, is that the fire does not die and the door does not lock. Any soul who comes up that road in the dark, in a storm, on the worst night of their life, will find a light in the window, a fire in the grate, and a man who will not ask their business before he asks if they're cold. That is not a slogan, that is the whole of what we are. An inn is a promise you make to strangers, and the promise is this: come in out of the dark. You are safe under my roof. I tell you about the fire first because the man who tried to take this inn from me, the man who very nearly did, came up that road as a stranger in a storm 40 years ago. And I gave him a room and a chair by that fire. And the next 40 years of my trust, he warmed himself at a hearth my family had kept burning for a century. And then he spent the back half of his life quietly building a way to put it out. My name is Abel Thorne. I am 71 years old, and I am the keeper of the Thorne Inn in the town of Calder, Vermont, the fourth of my name to keep it. I want to tell this slow, the way you build a fire, kindling first and then the larger wood, because the thing that nearly took the only home my family has ever had was not a stranger and not a storm. It was the one man I trusted the way I trust the sunrise, and he used the trust itself as the key. Let me lay the foundation first. The Thorne Inn has stood on the Calder Road since the 1880s, when this was a stop for the stage and a place for travelers to get out of the Vermont winter, which does not forgive a man caught in it. 4 generations of my family have run it. I was born in the room over the kitchen. I learned to walk in the front hall and to read by that fire, and to mix mortar repairing that chimney with my father when I was 9. I have buried both my parents from the front parlor and married my wife June in the side garden 44 years ago. And June and I raised our own children in the rooms upstairs and have run this house together every day since. It is not a hotel. I want to be clear about the difference, because the difference is the whole story. A hotel sells you a room. An inn takes you in. The town of Calder does not have a community center or a banquet hall or a funeral parlor. It has the Thorne Inn. Every wedding in this valley for 100 years has had its supper at our long table. Every wake has warmed itself at our fire. When the power goes out in an ice storm, which it does, the whole road knows to come to the inn, because the inn has the hearth and the wood stove and the well with the hand pump, and the inn does not turn the cold away. I have given rooms to people who could not pay and never mentioned it again. I have sat up all night with strangers having the worst night of their lives. My father told me, when he handed me the keys, that we were not in the business of renting beds. We were in the business of being the one warm, lit place a tired soul could count on. That is a thing you cannot put on a balance sheet. And it is the only thing the inn was ever really worth. I could tell you 100 nights to make you understand it. The January the Hadley baby came early in a blizzard, and the road to the hospital was shut. And the doctor and the mother and the whole frightened family rode it out in our front room by the fire. And a thorn boiled the water. And that child is grown now and brings her own children to eat at our table. The week of the big ice storm, when the power was down across 3 towns for 9 days, and half the road slept on our floors and ate from our wood stove because we were the only warm, lit place left standing, and nobody paid a cent, and nobody was asked to. The night a man I had never seen came up the road and sat by the fire and told me, somewhere around 2 in the morning, that he had been driving to the bridge over the Calder Gorge to end his life, and had seen our light instead and stopped. And I sat with him until dawn. And he is alive today and sends a card every Christmas signed only, "The man who saw the light." You do not get rich keeping a place like that. But you become, over 4 generations, the thing a whole valley leans on without thinking, the way you lean on the ground. That was what Ashford wanted to buy, and turn into $800 a night, and what Curtis Stedman wanted to turn into his retirement. And what neither of them ever understood was not for sale, because it was never mine to sell. It belonged to the road. June and I never got rich. An inn that takes people in does not get rich. It gets loved, which is a different and a better currency. But it does not pay a lawyer or a roofer. We did fine. We owned the place free and clear, my great-grandfather's deed handed down, and we lived simple and we kept the fire lit. And I assumed, the way a man does, that it would go on like that forever. And that when my time came, one of my children or some thorn yet unborn would keep the fire after me. Now I have to tell you about Curtis Stedman, and to tell it right, I have to start with the storm. 40 years ago, on a February night that I still think was the coldest I have known, a young man came up the Calder road on foot after his car went off the ice into the ditch 2 miles down. He was maybe 28, half frozen, a stranger, a city man with a law degree and no place in the world yet. Driving through to somewhere else, he saw the light in our window. Everyone always sees the light. That is what it is for. June put him by the fire, and I gave him soup and the blue room. And he stayed 3 days while the storm blew out and his car got pulled from the ditch. And in those 3 days, the way it happens by a good fire, we became friends. Curtis Stedman never left Calder. He said the inn was the first place that had ever felt like being taken in rather than checked into. And he meant it, and I believed him, because it was true. He hung out a law shingle in town. I steered him his first clients. He did our legal work from the start, the small things a country inn needs. And over the years, the small things became all the things. And Curtis Stedman became not just my lawyer, but my closest friend. He sat at that hearth 1,000 winter nights. He was godfather to my son. He gave the toast at my daughter's wedding in the side garden where I married June. It was a good toast, too. He talked about being a stranger taken in, about how a man without a place in the world had found one at the thorn fire, and there was not a dry eye in the garden. And I remember thinking I was the luckiest man alive to have found, in a half-frozen stranger off the road, a friend like that. When my son got into trouble as a young man, the kind of trouble that can follow a boy his whole life, it was Curtis who quietly made it go away and never sent a bill and never spoke of it again. When June had her cancer scare a dozen years back, Curtis sat in the hospital hall with me through the whole long day, and we did not talk much, because you do not have to talk much with a man you have known that long. I would have given Curtis Stedman a kidney. I would have given him the inn itself if he had asked. If he had said, "Abel, I am in trouble. I need help," the way I had helped him 100 times. He never asked. He could have had my help for the asking. And instead he chose to take my house with a fountain pen. And I have spent a long time trying to understand why a man does that. And the closest I have come is that some men cannot stand to be given a thing. They have to prove they were clever enough to take it. For 40 years, there was no document in my life he did not draw, and no trouble I did not bring to him first. I trusted Curtis Stedman with everything, completely, without a second thought. The way you trust the floor to be there when you put your foot down. That was the key I handed him, though I did not know it. Not a key to a door. The trust itself was the key. And a man who has your trust does not need to pick any lock. The trouble came, as it comes now to every beautiful old place in a beautiful old valley, from money, and from people who had discovered us. Calder stopped being a town nobody drove to and became a place people drove to on purpose. The valley filled up with second homes and the leaf peepers, and the kind of money that turns a working village into a destination. And a historic inn on the Calder road, with its 140 years and its great hearth and its 40 acres, became, on paper, worth a fortune. Not as what it was, as what it could be turned into. A boutique resort, a luxury property, a brand. A hospitality group out of Boston called Ashford began sniffing around the valley, buying up the old places and turning them into expensive versions of themselves. And the Thorn Inn, everyone agreed, would be the jewel of their collection. They came to me, the way they come to everyone, with a number that made June sit down. I told their man, politely, that the inn was not for sale, that you cannot sell a promise, that my great-grandfather did not light that fire so a company could put a $40 candle in the window and charge $800 a night for the view. I thought that was the end of it. It was not the end of it, because Ashford, when I turned them down, did what the powerful do now. They found the one door into my life that I had never once thought to guard, because I had handed the key to the man standing in it 40 years ago. They went to Curtis. I did not see it. That is the part I have to own, I, who had taken in 100 strangers and read them true by the fire, did not read the oldest friend I had, because you do not check the floor for soundness every time you cross the room. Looking back, the signs were there in the years before, Curtis pushing me, gently, persistently, to modernize, to think about my estate, to plan for what happens to the inn when I am gone. And 10 years ago, Curtis sitting me down by the fire with a stack of documents and a worried look, telling me that the inn was dangerously exposed, that if anyone ever slipped on our ice or got sick at our table, they could take the whole place. That I owed it to June and the children to protect it properly. He said the smart thing, the modern thing, was to put the inn into a trust and a company, layers of protection, and let him structure it so the Thorn Inn could never be taken by a lawsuit or a creditor. I signed what he put in front of me. Of course I did. I did not read it closely. Reading my own lawyer's documents closely, the documents of the man who toasted my daughter, would have felt like calling Curtis Stedman a liar in my own house. And I would no more have done that than I would have spat in the fire. I signed every page he tabbed, and I thanked him, and I felt safer, and we had a whiskey by the hearth. What I had actually signed, I would learn 10 years later, was the trap. The structure Curtis built did not protect the inn from creditors. It protected the inn for Curtis. He had layered the ownership through a trust and a holding company in a way I did not begin to understand. And buried in it, in the careful language of a man who knew exactly what every word meant when I knew none of them, was a tangle of provisions that made Curtis Stedman the controlling trustee, gave his entity a creeping interest that grew over time, and gave him, when certain conditions were met, the power to force a sale of the inn and to be first in line to acquire it. He had spent 10 years drawing the documents of my life so that, slowly and legally, the Thorn Inn would come to belong to him. And now, with Ashford waiting and the number high and me getting old, he was ready to spring it. He would trigger the sale, deliver the inn to Ashford for a fee and a stake, and walk away a wealthy man. And every page of it would have my signature on it. I found out when his own letter came, formal, on his firm's letterhead, the letterhead of my closest friend, informing me as trustee that he was exercising his authority to market the property, and that it would be best for everyone if I cooperated with an orderly transition. He had even begun, quietly, the way they all do, to let the valley know that poor Abel was getting on, that the inn was a lot for an old man and a tired old building, that it was probably time. I will not pretend I took it standing. It put me on the floor for the better part of a month. And the floor of an empty inn at night is a cold place, even with the fire going. Because the thing that broke me was not losing the inn. It was the documents. I got them out, finally, and I read them the way I should have 10 years before, and the worst part was that they appeared airtight. My signature was on every page. I had signed, freely, in my own hand, in my own parlor, with a whiskey at my elbow. And I sat there an old man and thought, I did this. I signed my family's 140 years away to a man I trusted, page by page, with a smile on my face. And now it is legal, and I have no standing. And I am a foolish old man who is going to be the thorn who finally let the fire go out. There were nights that month I sat alone by that hearth, the only thorn left who remembered why it was lit, and very nearly let myself believe there was nothing to be done, that the smart, modern, legal thing had beaten me, and that the trusting old way I had lived my whole life had finally cost me everything. The worst of it was a kind of shame I had never felt before. I have failed at things. Every innkeeper has a winter that nearly closes him, a roof he cannot afford, a season with no one on the road. But I had never felt like a fool. And that month, I felt like the biggest fool in Vermont. I would look at the fire my great-grandfather lit and think that it had survived 140 winters, 2 wars, 3 depressions, and the deaths of every thorn who ever tended it, and that it was going to go out at last, not because of any of that, but because the 4th thorn was a soft old man who signed whatever his friend put in front of him. I thought about my father handing me the keys and telling me what we were in the business of, and I could not look the memory of him in the eye. A man can stand losing to a storm, or a market, or his own bad luck. What had me on the floor was the thought that I had handed it away myself, with a smile, with a whiskey, and thanked the man for taking it. What turned me was June, and it was simple. She found me by the cold grey light of a winter morning, the fire low, the documents spread across the long table where 100 years of weddings had eaten. And she did not tell me it would be all right. She said, "Abel, you have taken in strangers off that road for 50 years, and you have almost never been wrong about a person. You were wrong about one. That is not a reason to stop trusting the world. It is a reason to go find somebody you can trust to help you fight this one." Then she built the fire back up, because that is the rule, and she went to make breakfast for the 2 guests we had, because the inn does not close just because the innkeeper's heart is broken. So in the morning I stopped being a beaten old man and went and did the one thing it had never occurred to me to do in 40 years. I got a second opinion. I drove 2 valleys over to a young lawyer named Dana Pruitt, who had no connection to Curtis Stedman or to Calder or to anyone. And I put my whole life on her conference table, every document Curtis had ever drawn, and I asked her to tell me the truth, that I had signed it all away and there was nothing to be done. She read for the better part of a week, and then she told me the thing that Curtis Stedman, in all his careful cleverness, had forgotten, because he had grown so used to my trust that he forgot it was a thing the law itself takes very seriously. She told me that a lawyer is a fiduciary, that when a lawyer draws documents for a client, he is bound, by the deepest rule of his whole profession, to act only in that client's interest, never his own. And that a lawyer who drafts instruments that benefit himself at his client's expense, who structures his client's affairs so that the client's property comes to the lawyer, who does all this without sending the client to independent counsel and without the client truly understanding what he signed, has not done clever lawyering. He has committed about the gravest breach there is. And the law, she told me, does not honor that, no matter how many pages I signed. Self-dealing by a fiduciary is voidable. The signatures do not save it. They are the evidence of the very trust that was betrayed. The more airtight and self-serving Curtis had made those documents, the more perfectly they proved that my own lawyer had drawn them to take my property, and the easier they would be to tear up. His cleverness was not his armor, it was the confession. She told me one more thing, that what Curtis had done was not only voidable in a courtroom, it was the kind of thing that ends a lawyer. That the board which licenses attorneys in this state exists precisely to disbar a man who turns his client's trust into his own profit. And that the file I was holding, the careful, self-dealing documents in Curtis Stedman's own hand, was not just my defense, it was, if I chose to use it, the end of his life as a lawyer in Vermont. And then I found the last thing myself. In the iron box in the cellar where 4 generations of thorns have kept what matters. The original deed, my great-grandfather's deed to the inn, in my family's name, that I had handed to Curtis to fold into his trust. Except I had not handed him the original. I had handed him a copy and kept the original, the way my father taught me to keep the original of anything that mattered. and Curtis had built his whole tower on a recording he assumed had buried the old deed, and had never once thought that the foolish, trusting old innkeeper might have quietly kept his own. My father had told me, the day he gave me the keys, never to hand the original of anything to anybody, friend or family or lawyer, and to keep it where 4 generations of Thorns had kept what mattered, and I had done it out of habit and never once thought I would need it. The same way I had kept the fire out of habit and never thought the day would come when keeping it was the whole fight. I had him completely. The documents were void, the breach was disbarment, and the foundation deed was in my own hand in an iron box. The easy thing, the thing a younger or a colder man would have done, would have been to send Dana Pruitt to the courthouse and the licensing board both, and tear Curtis Stedman's whole life down to the studs from a safe distance. But this is an inn, and I had to do it the way an inn does things, which meant by the fire, to his face, in front of the people it belonged to. So I did not go to court first. I invited Curtis to the inn. I told him I was ready to discuss the transition, and I asked him to bring the Ashford people, and I let him believe the old man had finally seen sense. And I asked a few others to be there too. June, Dana Pruitt, old Judge Amos Reed, who has sat in the same chair by our hearth every Friday night for 30 years, and who, before he retired, knew more law than Curtis Stedman ever would. And, because an inn is the town's house and not just mine, I left the front door open the way it always is, and a fair number of Calder drifted in out of the cold, the way they always do, and stayed. When Curtis arrived with the 2 men from Ashford in their good coats, the front room of the Thorn Inn was full of the town, and the fire was high. And I think he understood before he had his coat off that the meeting was not going to be the one he came for. It was a cold, clear night, the kind Vermont does in February, the windows black and the fire throwing the only warm light in the world. The town had drifted in the way it does, and stayed the way it does, so there were 30 or 40 people in that front room, on the settles and the stairs and standing along the wall, people whose weddings had been at our table and whose parents we had waked by our fire. People Curtis Stedman had drawn deeds and wills for, his neighbors and his clients for 40 years. They were quiet. They did not know exactly what they had come to, only that Abel Thorne had asked the town to the inn on a winter night, and the town comes when the inn calls. Because for 140 years, the inn has come when the town called. Curtis stood in the doorway with the Ashford men, and I watched him take in the room, the full house, June by the kitchen door, Dana Pruitt with her folder, old Judge Reed in his chair by the fire with his hands folded on his cane. And I watched the certainty go out of his face by degrees, the way the warmth goes out of a room when a door is left open too long. I did not start with the law. I started with the storm. I have learned, in 50 years of taking people in, that you reach a man through the door you first let him in by. So I reminded him, in front of everyone, of a February night 40 years ago, and a young man half frozen on the Calder road, and a light in a window, and soup, and the blue room, and 3 days by this fire that turned a stranger into a friend. I told him I had given him the warmest thing I had, which was not the room and not the soup, but the trust. The same trust my family had been handing to strangers off that road for 140 years. And I told him, quietly, that he had taken that trust, the rarest thing I owned, and spent 10 years filing it into a weapon to take the very house that had taken him in. I watched it land on him, in front of the town, and I will tell you what I saw, because it was not what I expected. Curtis Stedman did not look ashamed, not at first. He looked, for a moment, almost defiant, because he had spent 10 years telling himself a story, and the story was that he had done nothing wrong. He said it out loud, even, his voice steady, the lawyer to the last. He said, "Every document is valid. Abel, you signed every page. I broke no law." And there it was, the whole of what he had become, laid out by his own mouth in front of the people who had trusted him. A man telling a room full of his neighbors that because a thing was legal, it was not theft. That was when Judge Reed spoke, from his chair by the fire, not loud. He said, "Curtis, I have known you 30 years, and you know better than any man here that legal and right are not the same word, and that the law you are hiding behind is the very law that is going to take your license. Because there is no court in this state that lets a lawyer draw his client's house into his own pocket and call it valid." And I watched Curtis Stedman understand, finally, that the room he had always been the smartest man in was not on his side. That the cleverness that was his whole life had just been named for what it was in front of everyone whose opinion he had ever cared about. And that he had not outmaneuvered a foolish old innkeeper at all. He had been let all the way in, the way the inn lets everyone in, so that the truth could be told to his face by his own fire. I let Dana lay out the cold part then, for the Ashford men, because they needed to see it die. She told them, plainly, that the instruments Curtis had built his authority on were the self-dealing of a fiduciary and would not survive a single morning in a courtroom. That the controlling trust was void, that the foundation deed to the property was held free and clear in the Thorne family's name and always had been, and that there was nothing here for Ashford to buy because the man purporting to sell it had no power to sell anything. The two men in the good coats did the arithmetic that men like that do, and they gathered their coats and made their cold apologies and went back out into the Vermont night. And the inn, which has watched a great many people leave over 140 years, watched them go. That was the first blow. And it was the one that mattered. There was a second, and Curtis knew it before I said it, because he had told me himself what it was. I held in my hand the documents that would end him. One call from Dana Pruitt to the licensing board, one filing, and Curtis Stedman would never practice law again. And the breach was plain enough that the call would land. Everyone in that room knew I had it. Curtis knew it best of all. I did not make the call. Not because he had not earned it, because of what this inn is. My great-grandfather lit that fire so that no soul who came up the Calder road in the dark would be turned away into the cold. And that promise does not come with an exception for the ones who have wronged you. Or it is not a promise at all. It is just a nice thing we do for people we like. I was not going to take a man who first came to me frozen and friendless and put him back out in the dark with nothing. Even a man who had tried to take my house. Because the day the Thorne Inn does that is the day the fire might as well go out. So I told Curtis, in front of the town, that I would not be reporting him to the board, that I would not take his license or his livelihood, that he could go on being a lawyer. But I told him this too. The documents were void, and the inn was mine, and our 40 years were over. He was no longer my lawyer or my friend, and he would undo every paper he had drawn, and then he would not sit by this fire again. I was not going to put him out in the cold, but a man who turns the trust of a whole valley into a tool to rob the one house that took him in does not need me to ruin him. The valley would do that on its own, the way it had already begun to in that very room. Because the only thing a small-town lawyer truly owns is the trust of his neighbors. And Curtis Stedman had just spent every cent of his in front of all of them, for an inn he was never going to get. I could see, as he gathered his coat, that he understood that the mercy I was showing him was, in its way, a heavier sentence than the board would have handed down. He was going to keep his license and lose his place in the world, and live out his years in a valley that knew exactly what he was, in the cold of his own making. While my fire went on burning, he left without a word. The town stayed. June put more wood on the fire and started bringing out food the way she does, because a room full of people on a cold night is not a crisis at the Thorne Inn. It is just a Tuesday. It is the whole point of the place. Dana Pruitt undid Curtis's tower, every void instrument of it, and helped me set the inn up the honest way, the simple way, owned free and clear in the Thorne name, with a plain and decent plan for the day I am gone. Drawn by a lawyer, I checked this time, because June was right. The lesson was never to stop trusting. It was only to keep my own original in the iron box and read the pages before I sign, and then go on being a man who leaves his door unlocked. Because the alternative, a bolted door and a cold hearth, and a life spent suspecting every stranger of being Curtis Stedman, is not a life worth the keeping. He took enough from me. He was not going to take that too. The fire is still burning. It has not gone out in 140 years, and it did not go out that winter, when it came the closest it ever has. The lantern is still lit in the window every night, for whatever tired soul is out on the Calder road in the dark. My granddaughter is 15 and learning the rooms, and she asked me last week why we never lock the door, with all the strange people who come through, after what happened. And I told her the truth. I told her that one man in 50 years used that open door against us, and that if I bolted it now to keep out the next Curtis Stedman, I would also be bolting it against the next frozen young stranger who needs soup and a fire and the chance to become a friend, and that the second one comes up that road far more often than the first. You keep the fire lit. You leave the light in the window. You take the stranger in. Most of them are exactly who they seem, and the rare one who is not, you handle by the fire, to his face, and then you build the fire back up and you put the kettle on, because the cold is still out there, and the inn is still the warm, lit place. And that, in the end, is the only thing the Thorn Inn was ever truly worth. They thought a foolish old man had signed his house away. They forgot that the man had kept the original in an iron box, and that the law itself protects the ones who trust, and that you cannot take a house from a family by the very trust the house was built to give. The fire is lit, the door is open, and it will be, long after the last of them has gone back out into the dark.